Dream Psychology, Chapter 4, Dreams and Cartoons. To record an event by drawing the idea of it in your mind is simple, as long as the idea is simple. If the idea is that the king of Assyria smote a certain city, you have only to draw the city and the king smiting it. But if the idea is that monarchical government is bad because it brings an abnormal focus certain necessary human passions that otherwise would be remain diffuse and harmless, how will you draw it? Simple ideographs are useless, but there is a method that is used for depicting such ideas. It is the method of the cartoon, whereby form and thought find a plane of contact. The political cartoon of the week has some points in common with a dream. It is a product which is more or less meaningless, save to a man who knows something of the political situation. It is a pictorial symbolism, whose elements require a kind of interpretation, and it does not conform to the pattern of reality entirely. It drops continually into symbols, and where it drops is at the point where meaning escapes the power of simple, direct portrayal. It is a mingling of focused and unfocused meaning. And by this mingling, according to the skill of the cartoonist, a significance results that requires a lengthy explanation. It covers a wide area of thought. It contains a condensation of meaning, and we have already seen that the language of unconscious gesture is a language of symbolisms that contain meaning in a latent and condensed form. The idea concerning monarchical government could be rendered by this method. A king with a burning glass focused on Europe and the sun overhead, with the name of his nation written across it, might, for example, form the main symbols of the cartoon. But what is apparent is that an immense number of ways offer themselves to the cartoonist when he seeks to portray abstract ideas. He is not governed by the laws of the ordinary artist. His only limitation is the necessity of remaining reasonably comprehensible. This limitation does not operate in the same case of unconscious activity, for even coherence is not typical in the dream. Some conditions certainly favor coherence. Times of great mental stress or moral conflict are frequently accompanied by vivid dreaming, and in a way it might be said that vividness and coherence in dreams go hand in hand. But this coherence is not relative to intelligibility, but is rather a coherence in the sequence of events, which are related to one another by a kind of naturalness. But when they are reviewed in the morning, they present a clear, well-knit picture, which, unlike a cartoon, is unintelligible. It may profoundly intrigue the fancy, but how is it possible to handle it? If the analogy between the cartoon and the dream is pursued, a possibility of handling the dream is suggested by a consideration of the way in which a cartoon is approached. The cartoon is the result of circumstances affecting national life. To understand it, these circumstances must be known. Now, if it be said that dreams result from certain circumstances affecting individual life, a prejudice must be examined first, before the larger issue of these circumstances can be freely undertaken. For some people will say that the circumstances are well known, and that they consist in physical disturbances. A late supper, it may be contended, constitutes the circumstantial cause of much dreaming. And that is as far as one need look for the whole theory and explanation of dreams. The late supper school, that is, the school of physical causation, does not, however, furnish a wholly satisfactory argument. There is no doubt that late suppers and other disturbances of physical equilibrium provoke dreaming, but if you were to say that they constitute the explanation of dreaming, you might as well see that that recent shower of rain, the whole explanation of that green tinge that now covers the desert plain. It's simply an example of a common confusion in thinking. Either the activities that underlie dreams are intensified by certain physical disharmonies, or the awareness of dreaming is increased by some lowering of threshold value. But the physical disharmonies do not in themselves explain the dream. They act as sensitizers. The developing solution that flows from a photographic plate is not the explanation of the areas of light and shade that appear on the white surface. It merely reveals what was already there, and what was already there depends on circumstances unconnected with the developer. From what kind of circumstances, then, do dreams arise? In looking at a political cartoon, it's possible to imagine a great number of threads of interest, national, social, and personal, converging onto it and determining its symbolism. Now, though the dream is infinitely more complicated than the cartoon, it has in the same way behind its symbolism a great number of converging threads of interest. This is very easily proved. The incidents of most dreams cover certain episodes, places, and people that are quite familiar. These elements, brought together in an apparently haphazard way in the dream, represent different threads of interest. Each one is, so to speak, a gateway that opens into a long avenue of recollections, feelings, and thoughts. You dream that an acquaintance is sitting in your study wearing a khaki uniform. The acquaintance, your study, and the khaki uniform at once form three separate threads of interest. The dream brings these threads together for some reason. A dream, therefore, might be regarded as a patchwork pattern of interest. The formation of the pattern differs from the dispositions of interest in consciousness. The acquaintance may never have been in your house. He may never have worn a uniform. Yet, the dream, according to its peculiar tendency, disposes these objects of interest in a new formation. It produces a new and unthought-of pattern, and this is a fact that people recognize instinctively when they say, in the presence of the unexpected or extraordinary event, that no one would have ever dreamed it possible. The dream then seems to arise out of the individual interests, in that its component parts are people, events, and places that are familiar, but its method of combining these parts is distinctive and full of surprises. Looked at from the surface, it is a process that handles the individual's interests in an unexpected manner. Now, what is unexpected proximates to what is not thought of or not conscious. Therefore, the dream is not only a product of unconscious activity in the sense that it is woven by something beyond conscious effort, but it is also a presentation of interest in a form that hitherto was unexpected and unthought of, and so unconscious to the individual. This point requires to be made plain, and for this purpose I will cite some dream examples. Number 1, quote, I was staying in a large hotel on the coast. The hotel is one I had often seen from the outside, but I've never lived there or have even been inside. I was rather perplexed to find that it was really a cathedral that had been adapted to accommodate guests, and was chilly and uncomfortable. The manager was a priest with an aesthetic face, and he carried a bell. The bell was the dinner bell belonging to my old home. He rang the bell at intervals, and then he pointed to a tablet on the wall. Some Latin inscription was on it, which reminded me of an incident in my early school days when the headmaster flung a book at me because I used, in translating some passage, the term arable land instead of something more poetical. Then I noticed the priest had become rather like the headmaster. He took me by the arm and he spoke earnestly to me, and he pointed to the tablet again. I saw now 3 shining objects on it, like stars. These merged into one. End of quote. In the dream, it will be seen how an entirely unexpected and unthought of pattern of interest is produced. The new pattern is a presentation of interest in the form that was unthought of and unconscious to the individual, and it was woven by an activity of whose processes and machinery the dreamer was unconscious. It is worthwhile looking more closely at the dream. I have said that a dream seems to arise out of individual interests, and that its component parts are familiar. This applies to the larger part of the majority of dreams. But there are sometimes curious and unfamiliar combinations, such as the 3 shining objects in the above example, and these link up with familiar interests only with difficulty. Like the new words that so often crop up in dreams, they constitute a kind of ideational neoplasm. Sometimes they are beyond solution. At other times, as in this case, there are certain hints surrounding them that set up a train of interest and so establish some mental relationships. Now, this dream, although so many interests seem confused and compressed in it, maintains outwardly a sort of coherence, which we may compare to the outer form of the cartoon, and like the cartoon, it has a certain neatness in its manner of symbolism. A bell in the hands of the priest is not unnatural. The dream adds to its significance by making it the dinner bell belonging to the dreamer's old home. By means of the tablet on the wall with its suggestion of a Latin inscription, a channel of interest is opening up, reaching to school days, and this is then reinforced by a likeness to the headmaster becoming visible in the priest's face. There is also a kind of theme based on contrasts running through it. This is indicated at the opening by the fusion of the hotel and the cathedral. It is again suggested by the fact that the priest carries a dinner bell. The hotel and the dinner bell form natural associations on one side, while the cathedral and the priest are related on the other side. The Latin inscription is associated by the dreamer with a certain failure to rise to an occasion in the past, a failure to translate a passage in sufficiently poetical language. This inscription is afterwards replaced by 3 shining stars, a symbolism that need not be discussed here, and they are pointed out by the priest schoolmaster in an earnest manner. In the dream, which I have given in the words of the dreamer, there are certain parts which make the dream and certain parts which belong to the dream as afterthoughts or associations, and the whole constitutes the record as turned out by the memory. It is only natural, from what we have seen, that fringes of association should be added to the actual material of the dream, since the material is made up of individual interests, and these ramify endlessly. But if an attempt is made to investigate the above dream more closely, a method now reveals itself. It is the method of association, which obtains in the dream and not only forms the symbolism, but is the key to the interpretation of the symbolism as well. Each element in the dream represents, as we have seen, a gateway leading into an avenue of interest. If the gateways be traversed by asking the dreamer to discuss, in the most candid manner, each incident and figure of his dream, then new significance begin to take shape. As an example, I will give some observations made by the dreamer on 2 separate elements in the above dream. A. The bell. Quote, "It does not ring now. I think it is cracked or lost. Its sound used to vibrate through the small house, and I was never glad to hear it, as meals were more in the nature of a duty than a pleasure to me, owing to family quarrels." End quote. The symbol of the bell, therefore, is a gateway that leads up to an avenue of unpleasant associations. It is also something more. It is connected not with pleasure, but with duty. Now this symbol is in the hand of the priest, with the aesthetic face. B. The priest. Quote, his face reminded me at first of Cardinal Newman. I had been reading Tolstoy's Conversion, in brackets, Motive of Dream, and thinking of Newman, and wondering who was the better man. I would not have liked to know either of them. Tolstoy's home must have been uncomfortable in later years. This forms a link with the bell and the family quarrels at meals. Conversion, if it means making everyone uncomfortable, including yourself, seems to me a thing to avoid, yet I know it is inevitable for some. My old headmaster was not aesthetic looking. He was down on me because I was idle, and I feared him. When I used that phrase, arable land, he raved, and he ended by saying, I could do better if I tried. I remember that sentence very well, and the look of reproval, and I don't think I grasped my poetical lapse at all. It was a bit out of Virgil. I have forgotten all my Latin. End quote. The symbol of the priest thus taps a considerable volume of thought, of which I have given a synopsis. It brings out the question of conversion, that is, a complete change in one's attitude towards life, and behind this, a suggestion of individual inadequacy. It is not my intention to elaborate on the dream, but to use it only as an example of a method of approach whereby a wider significance is given to the symbolism. The bearing of dreams on the individual will be considered more intimately in a later part of the book. Another example may be cited here in order to show the affinities that exist between the cartoon and the dream. Number 2, quote, I was in the presence of the king. He was about to confer some decoration on me. He pinned on my breast a medal, which was either the VC or the DSO, but I noticed that the medal had upon it the word whip, WHIP, upside down. In this end quote. In this example, the scene is exactly comparable to the atmosphere of a cartoon. It could be drawn as it stands. The important function is delineated, but an element of grotesqueness is introduced. Some associations given by the dreamer were as follows. A. Whip, WHIP. Quote, I had thrashed a native camp follower that day for a self-inflicted injury. The native struck himself with his brass feeding bowl on my head and drew blood. I have no idea why the word should have been on the medal. B. The king. Quote, the presentation of the VC by the king is the highest honor one can obtain. End quote. It is to the outward similarity between the method of presentation of the dream and the cartoon that attention is drawn. A cartoon that had as its object some shade of irony, some reflection on it, some reflection on an otherwise excellent character, might assume a form that corresponded with this dream. The word which appeared reversed on the medal, giving the clue to the nature of the irony intended. And that concludes Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is called Interpretation. Till soon.